Development involves change, and change always happens in a context. When we forget this, we often introduce our reforms or our policies in ways that are less than optimal. We might introduce a new form that looks good on paper, but that doesn't actually work. When we take the context into consideration, we introduce policies and reforms that function, even if sometimes they don't look that good. Let me give you an example of the two different realities as I see them in a case of internal audit reform in Malaysia and Burkina Faso. In 1979 in Malaysia, they introduced internal audit in the way that it was suggested by the International Association of Internal Auditors. They introduced a fantastic new law that was perfect on paper. They also came in and introduced a bunch of regulations about how that law was meant to be introduced. And then they made requirements that every single ministry adopt an internal audit unit that hired professional internal auditors. The model on paper was the best in the world at the time. In 2003, they had an evaluation to ask how well it was functioning, and they found that there were some problems. Very few professional internal auditors were hired in the government. Very few internal audit agencies were in place, and very few of the regulations were followed. The response was to double down and pass a new law. But when they actually looked to see what was going on, they found that there were a lot of other laws in place already that did similar things or that made that law very difficult to implement. There were a bunch of other regulations in place already that made these ones almost impossible to follow. And there were other units and other organizational entities that clashed with the ones that existed and that hired a different set of people. Now, if you're looking at the board and you're saying, wow, this is very, very messy, it should be. And one of the reasons why it was difficult for this reform to work was because the context was messy. Now, in Burkina Faso, in the mid-2000s, the government confronted a messy situation like this. They had a lot of different organizational entities and players providing a bunch of different functions that were similar to internal audit, but they didn't have an internal audit function. But they had gaps in this. And one of the gaps was that they didn't have really good risk monitoring in the government. So they started to say, well, let's fill that gap with people who can provide risk mapping. And when they started to provide the risk mapping, they found many places where they had similar gaps, and they provided those risk maps throughout the government. They started to train people who could do that specific thing, and after a while, they started to formalize what the regulations would look like so that they could do this in a more formal way. After a few years, Burkina Faso had something that looked very much like internal audit, but wasn't the best practice in form. It functioned, but it didn't necessarily look like what Malaysia had. Now, the moral of the story is very simple. We need to take context seriously when we do our interventions. And sometimes we need to create things that don't look good, but that function in the way that we want them to.